Thanks for your time. First of all, why didn't you ask for federal support for your businesses?
Well, I think we've got a clear demarcation between the federal government support and the state level of support. We've always been supporting those small businesses. The feds have been supporting employees. In this instance, we didn't need to get that support from the federal government. We put a very generous package of stimulus and support for our small business sector in South Australia who are genuinely affected by the restrictions that remain necessarily in place in South Australia. In fact, it's our second package that we've announced this year, and I'm hopeful that we won't need to do too much more because we are really starting to reduce our restrictions down in South Australia as our numbers continue to fall.
Can you see the point that Matt Kean, the New South Wales Treasurer, is making, though, that this is a national shock and there should be national support for this sort of business arrangement in the face of this Omicron wave?
I've got to say, though, Kieran, the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, have been enormously generous to the states. There's no way we could have got through the coronavirus or this Omicron wave without the incredible support that we've received from the federal government in increased health funding. I think we've got a clear understanding at the National Cabinet who is responsible for what. Very often the feds have been able to lend a hand. In this instance, though, in South Australia at least, we've been able to manage that support for our small business sector, as well as that a massive stimulus program as we start to see people in South Australia now go back to school, go back into the office environment, and of course our restrictions being lifted. We're not out of the woods yet. We've still got some time to go, but our vaccination rates are going through the roof. I think we've got the highest booster vaccination rate in the country at the moment. That's providing great, I think really great risk management and protection for South Australians. We're seeing those numbers really falling in our state at the moment, and that means more people can get out and about spending their money. That's the most important thing for small business, Kieran, is people being out, supporting their businesses, spending money, creating jobs, not a handout from government all the time.
Is it fair to say as well that your package is not as generous as the Perrottet government's plan, which covers 20% of a small to medium-sized business's payroll? From looking at the details of your plan, while there are grants and so on, it is not as broad in its scope.
No, I think ours is more generous, Kieran. Don't want to correct you there, but there's caps out at $5,000 per week for 4 weeks. $20,000 maximum that they can get under their program. They've got to show at least a 40% fall in revenue. Ours is 30% fall in revenue and caps out at $44,000, so more than double the New South Wales package. Of course, they've got a lot more small businesses than us, and of course they're a lot harder hit than we've been in South Australia. We've still had the fewest days in lockdown of any state in Australia, and that's really translated into some good economic results for South Australia. You might notice that last financial year we had the strongest growing economy in the entire nation, first time ever, and we've currently got the lowest unemployment rate in the history of South Australia. So we are doing relatively better, but there are businesses which are adversely affected by the restrictions that are in place.
Sure.
We want to help those small businesses across this bridge, but my major focus is on growing the demand and the economy out the other side.
Now, if you had your time again, you did, of course, oversee the reopening of the state from November 23rd. Would you have made that same call, given the numbers of COVID you're seeing in your state right now and the impact on those businesses we're talking about?
Well, look, Kieran, we opened our state borders in accordance with the national framework, which was for the 23rd of November, when we got to that 80% double vaccinated rate for all of those 16 and over. That was what the Doherty Institute advised the National Cabinet. That's what we all signed up for, and that's what we implemented in South Australia. Now, subsequent to that, the World Health Organisation was notified by South Africa, and then subsequent to that again, the World Health Organisation declared a variant of concern. So we didn't know that when we opened the border in South Australia. Can I just say there were tens of thousands of South Australians who were locked out of their own state because of that hard border arrangement that we had in place. This was completely unacceptable. By lifting that border, we're allowed to reunite tens and tens of thousands of people here over Christmas. Yes, Omicron has been a massive challenge here in South Australia, right across the country, right across the world. We hit that peak. We put some additional restrictions in place in South Australia. We're well past that peak in South Australia now. We're lifting restrictions, and I'm very hopeful that going into the future, we continue to have that strong economic performance that we've enjoyed for much of the last 2 years.
So you'd make that same call again?
You can only make a decision with the information that's available at the time. We opened the borders on the 23rd. The World Health Organisation didn't even know about Omicron on the 23rd of November. But as soon as we did learn about it, we analysed the situation. We considered various options. We decided to continue without slamming the border back in place. People need consistency as much as possible during these coronavirus and other pandemic issues. That's what we provided, a really clear plan to open. We signed up to that national agenda, and I don't regret that. Obviously, we've been trying to deal, like the rest of the world has, with Omicron. I think South Australia stood up very well. We're well past that peak now.
Now, you've got homeschooling in South Australia for the first couple of weeks of school. That's not in line with what the Prime Minister had been urging the states to do. Can you explain your reasoning behind having some or most of the years of school not in face-to-face learning to start the school year?
Yeah, good question. Schools are back open in South Australia today for children of emergency services work or essential workers in South Australia and those from a vulnerable community. Classes start on Wednesday. 40% of those will be face-to-face in our schooling environment. 60 will be learning from home. They'll be back on the 14th of February. So it is a disrupted start to our year, but we were convinced by the modelling that was done in South Australia that this would continue to plummet. Our positive cases in South Australia wouldn't put pressure on our hospitals in South Australia. It would allow us to further ease restrictions in South Australia, which is good for jobs, good for our economy and good for our overall plan in South Australia. Yes, it's disruptive for families, but I think we've got the balance about right in South Australia.
Now, finally, I want to ask you about Paige Carter, South Australian woman who's made a personal plea to you to be able to see her dying grandmother. I'm sure you're aware of this case. What will you do? Will you allow her in and this very personal and emotional plea that's been made to you?
Yes, well, Kieran, of course, that was a plea that was made on Thursday last week. On Friday, SA Health reached out to the family. Unfortunately, their family member, their loved one, passed away in the early hours of Saturday. So this is another one of the tragic cases of Omicron, of the coronavirus. Obviously, our clinicians make these decisions. They've got a pretty tough task, Kieran, because uppermost in their mind is, of course, infection control. When I looked at those numbers out of New South Wales yesterday, I think it was their deadliest day. The vast majority occurred in those vulnerable settings. Infection control is king during a pandemic. And so we need to leave those decisions to the clinicians. But my thoughts and condolences with the family of this woman who has passed away. I think it was a very tough decision to reduce visitation across our health system, but I genuinely believe that this was made with the best interests of all South Australians in mind.
Premier Marshall, I appreciate your time. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kieran.